Today we're discussing the classic or the city blues. This is usually a type of blues that has a small band behind it with usually a female singer. And the title of this is Vaudeville and Black Pearls, and we'll see why as we go along. The first part should be obvious that a lot of these early classic blues singers, they got their start in vaudeville and were touring with vaudeville troupes like the Rabbit Foot Minstrels. We'll see that Gertrude Mulroney was touring with them. And so while some of the earliest moments of the classic blues are mired or lost rather in history, lost to history, we do have a sense of how they were making their living, and we have some evidence for the early introduction of the blues into these repertoires in the very beginning of the 20th century. But of course, the classic blues and blues in general doesn't really emerge into the public scene until around 1920. A little bit before that was some of the orchestrated blues of W.C. Handy, as we'll see when we talk a little more about the Blues Craze, as we've already seen a bit with Handy. But the 1920s is the key date as far as recordings go, and that has to do with OK Records, and we'll talk about that further on. Of course, we're dealing with the period of the Great Migration. This is a photo from 1921. It's from the Florida archives, and you can see the people crowded into the train station here, trying to travel north. So migration north created an enlarged market for Southern music, including what is sometimes called race music or hillbilly records, right? So people would leave their homes in the South, leave their families, leave the areas that they've invested their lives in that are familiar to them, and they go largely to these cities, Detroit, Chicago, New York, Philly, and so on. And they would live in the Chicago's the great example, of course, where you have these expanded neighborhoods for the relatively poor. They were attracted to coming north because, for instance, the Chicago paper, the North Star, advertised jobs. Those jobs weren't always available when you actually got up there, and they weren't always available. Even when they were available, they weren't always available at the rates, at the salary that had been advertised in the newspaper. But given the problems in the South in the Jim Crow era, given the fact that even though slavery had ended, de facto slavery had not, right? There's a distinction between de jure slavery and de facto slavery. De jure slavery means that it's a law that you can have slaves. Obviously, after 1865, that was no longer the case in the U.S. But de facto slavery is where the same conditions of slavery basically apply. In fact, in some ways, as I mentioned in another context, for some people, some ex-slaves writing about this era claim that things actually got a little worse for them. That, before they had to work long hours and they weren't treated very well, but they had their meals paid for, they had their housing paid for, they didn't have to worry about that. Now they're not treated very well and they have to work long hours, and they're treated as less than human, but they also have to pay for their own accommodations and their own food. So they become, in essence, victims of capitalism. Of course, slaves are already victims to capitalism, but here, in a sense, it's made all that much more apparent. So many people want to leave the South. They want to come to the North in hopes of making a way for themselves, in hopes of finding wage labor. And then what that winds up doing is it creates this very crowded tenement housing situation. And it also creates a nostalgia for home and for the music that you might have heard at home. So music that wasn't recorded prior to this moment, not that we're that deep into the history of recording music yet, but music that was not recorded very often prior to this, like hillbilly music or what we call country music and blues and race music, now becomes recorded more often. One of the things that allows for that to happen is the increasing use of portable studio recordings. So here you see a picture from 1916. This is quite early, actually. Francis Densmore who's an ethnomusicologist, is trying to preserve some songs of various Native American tribes. And so here you can see she's recording somebody. And this is a portable recording studio. You can tell they're just in a location. Actually, it looks like they're outside. But she would set up usually in hotel rooms, and that became very typical of people like Ralph Peer as well, and we'll talk about him in a moment, where you set up in a hotel room, you set up some curtains to dampen the sound so that you don't get egregious echo, and you have this portable recording studio. It's not quite as good as far as fidelity and quality goes as the studios in New York, but you can bring the studio to them. And that means that you don't have to pay for their travel. That means that you don't have to pay for much at all. You don't have to pay for their accommodation or pay for part of it. You don't have to wait for people to come to you. You go to them. So there are several very important dates here, moments where people bring in a portable recording studio to places like Atlanta or like Bristol, Tennessee, and they record the local talent there. They pay them very little, if anything. They can also say that they're recording them on spec, right? You'll record this one for free, and then if it sells well, we'll get back in touch, and they may or may not, right? So with this enlarged market, what you do is you create these remote recordings with the portable recording studio. You go to the South to make the records, and then you sell them mostly in the North, but also in the South. And we'll see how that works, especially with country music when we get there. We'll talk a lot about the economics of that, and we'll talk a bit about it in this session as well with respect to the blues. Something that's happening that's important for the 1920s is, of course, the radio and the phonograph, but especially the radio, is moving into the home. Keep in mind that the radio, when it starts off, was mostly a hobbyist kind of enterprise. A young man and his father might go into the garage, they work on the radio, and the batteries would leak. You wouldn't want that thing in your living room. And besides, early on with the radio, there wasn't broadcast radio anyway. You were just sending out signals and receiving signals. You weren't really hearing broadcasts. But by the time we get into the 20s, of course, you have radio shows, comedy shows, and music shows. You have most of the music that's being performed on the radio at this time is performed live in the studio, so you're not hearing records. That the equipment isn't good enough for that yet. But the radio itself is becoming a piece of furniture, and part of the way that it does that is through what's called sheathing. What you do is you take the uglier parts of that apparatus and you put them in something that looks like a nice little furniture box. And the best example here is really this Rogers batteryless radio receiving set, right? Notice it's a radio receiving set, meaning that you can't broadcast your own signal. You're only receiving signals. And that, of course, is the same kind of radio most of us have now. Some of you might have a CB. I don't know what you do. Maybe you drive around in a truck, broadcast on a CB, but most of us don't. Most of us just have receivers, and that's what you see here for the most part. And you can see various stages of this. You see the RCA ad up at the top, and then you see the Rogers, and then you see this work right ad, which is interesting because notice that you have a gentleman and then his daughter and the wife. So no longer is the radio thought of as being a boy's enterprise or a man's enterprise, but it's something that the family does together. So a lot of times these phonograph companies are related to furniture companies. For one example is the Paramount Records, right? They're the second to enter the race market in 1922 after OK Records, and we're going to talk about that moment in a second. But they were a subsidiary of the Wisconsin Chair Company, so they are a furniture company. And a lot of the early radio companies and early phonograph companies are related to furniture companies. The idea is to furnish the home. All right, switching gears a little bit. There you see all the way to the right, Sherman Dudley. Sherman H. Dudley was a very important vaudevillian actor, obviously a black actor, who was also a entrepreneur. So he wasn't just someone that was on the circuit. He really helped form the circuit. He really helped create it as a business enterprise. And what he did was he established the Theater Owners Booking Association. The people in the circuit sometimes joke that the Toba was really stood for tough on black asses, right? So when you were on this circuit, you were supposedly on Toba time. That's what they would call it. And the idea was that there was a prefabricated touring schedule for you. So you and the rest of your group in a vaudeville ensemble or a vaudeville troupe, you would have a certain schedule where you'd be in one town one day, take the train to the next town, and another group would be ahead of you and another group would be behind you. And they're going more or less along the same route so that there's a constant availability of performers and of talent to these various theaters. Some of the theaters are black owned, some of the theaters are white owned. Early on, when Sherman Dudley first put this together, most of the theaters were owned by white businessmen, and that started to change quite a bit. And he, not obviously, but he did try to encourage the rise of black business. He tried to work closely with black theater owners. He established this in 1909, and it got a lot of press. This is why he became the most significant touring agency, basically. And so performers, including some very, very famous performers, would come from all over to try to get on Toba time. Now, this wasn't set up to be the most beneficial thing to the performers, because you had a certain amount of your money that went to accommodations. You had penalties when you came in late, even though it often wasn't your fault. If you came to a show drunk, there were penalties. So a lot of these people who would tour, a lot of the entertainers who would tour, would wind up actually being slightly in debt at the end rather than coming away with a salary, and then you sign up for another tour. So this is how they got you, in a sense, right? You were constantly part of this machine of entertainment. Now, the bigger stars, like for instance, you see here Matilda Ciceretta Joyner-Jones, who's also known as the Black Patty, right? So she's a black opera singer. She was quite a star on the circuit, and so she wound up buying her contract out. And then going on her own tour that was set up by her own agent. But then they sued her, not Dudley, but her former agent sued her. And that was a huge court case for a while within the entertainment world. So now the blues. What are some of the sources of the blues? It's hard to say exactly how the blues came about, right? It's just like any of these styles. Some styles we can trace fairly well because the people that we think of as being the progenitors of the style gave interviews or wrote books or articles or whatever. That's not the case with the early blues. We think the blues went back to the late 19th century. The first evidence as far as the written accounts are concerned that are clearly about the blues in the way that we would recognize the blues stem from the very turn of the 20th century, 1902, 1903. The first publications, as we'll see soon, that include the word the blues as a genre designation, those show up in the 19-teens, and of course the first recording of the blues that's not basically a ragtime derivative in the sense of W.C. Handy doesn't happen until 1920, and we're coming up to that in a moment. So it's hard to tell exactly where the blues came from. There are different theories. One is that it came out of these work songs, combined with African American ballads such as Frankie and Johnny or John Henry, and this is tied, of course, to the English ballad tradition. There were also field hollers or arhulis, right, when you're calling out across the fields to get the attention of other people, and there were certain melodic and poetic characteristics to those that involved repetition, and that might have fed into the blues. Then there's the songster tradition, right? This is the ragtime influence on the early blues and Broadway influence and minstrelsy, where performers, usually either free black performers or slave performers, when they had some free time, would do their own versions of these songs that they're hearing that derive from vaudeville and minstrelsy and the ragtime tradition. A lot of these songs and some of the ballads are played with the root fifth patterns that are similar to ragtime, and often the performers called these songs ragtime songs. So next time when we're talking a bit more about the country blues, we'll see a lot of ragtime influence, and we'll hear a bit of it today. When you listen to country blues, you'll definitely hear some ragtime and early jazz elements. And then to a lesser extent, perhaps the spirituals. Certainly the pitch inflection of the spirituals, but they share that with the work songs and the field hollers. But that notion of the blue note, right, of flatting the third degree and the seventh degree and sometimes the fifth degree, that comes from the work songs, the field hollers and the spirituals. That's part of the shared dialectic of these, or dialect rather, of these productions. The first time that the term blues was used in sheet music was the Negro Blues by Leroy Lassie's White. And you can see him there. That's him quite a bit older. He was much younger when he published this in 1912. But he wound up having a life in early Western films, and that's where I got this picture. It was recorded by George O'Connor in 1916. And it derives from the minstrel and vaudeville traditions. It's not exactly a 12-bar blues. It clearly has some elements that we would recognize as being related to the blues, but it's not a straightforward 12-bar blues. The first 12-bar blues to be published was the Memphis Blues, and it was published later that same year, 1912, and we'll talk a bit more about it in a moment. And that's the first to use the typical AAB lyrics, right? In this case, it's not really AAB so much as AAA prime. So it's the same lyric twice, and then the third time, it's very similar but just slightly changed. So although classic blues is the first to be recorded, that's 1920, of course. I keep pounding in that date because I think of it as a very important date. We'll see that the country blues has older roots, or at least we believe it to have older roots. It must have had older roots, and you'll get a sense as to why I say must soon. So here's W.C. Handy. W.C. Handy started touring with minstrel groups as early as 1892. He had several teaching gigs, but he found he made more money on tour. Now, while he was waiting for a train in Tutwiler, Mississippi in 1903, so this is one of the earliest accounts where we have something that we're pretty sure is the blues in our sense of the term. He had an experience that he often talked about in interviews and in his book. He writes, "A lean, loose-jointed Negro had commenced plunking a guitar beside me while I slept. As he played, he pressed a knife on the strings of the guitar in a manner popularized by Hawaiian guitarists who used steel bars. The singer repeated the line 3 times, accompanying himself on the guitar with the weirdest music I ever heard." So he's talking about the slide guitar approach that's very typical in country blues. So again, we can see that the earliest accounts of the blues in the early 1900s, they sound a lot more like country blues than city blues, and we'll talk about country blues next time. In 1905, while Handy was playing in a dance band, some of the people that were in the crowd, the audience, came up to him and asked for some of quote-unquote our native music. And he played something that he thought would please them. They weren't that into it, They liked all the stuff he was playing before, but they didn't feel like he played. And what they mean by our native music really is more traditionally black music, right? And he's playing a lot of these Sousa marches. He's playing a lot of minstrel music, and they want something a little more down home, right? So they ask if a local black band could play a few numbers, right? That's sometimes a little insulting. I don't know if you've ever been on a gig with a band and then someone comes up and says, do you mind if my cousin or my nephew plays a few tunes? And that happens a lot when you're in wedding bands. It never happened to me too often when I was in cover bands, or certainly not when I was in an original band. But in wedding bands, it happened all the time. Everyone had a cousin or a nephew that wanted to play a few numbers. So this is happening to Handy, and he describes it much like I'm describing it now. He wasn't happy about it. But then he writes this: "They struck up one of those over and over strains." So a tune that begins, that has the same phrase over and over, like a 12-bar blues, right? You're just cycling through that same progression over and over. That seemed to have no beginning and certainly no ending at all. You can hear the frustration in his voice a bit here, right? The strumming attained a disturbing monotony, but on and on it went. a kind of stuff associated with sugarcane rows and levee camps. Thump, thump, thump went their feet on the floor. It was not really annoying or unpleasant. Perhaps haunting is the better word, right? So notice there's a sort of ambivalence here. On the one hand, he's clearly annoyed. He's clearly looking down on this music as something that's highly repetitive, not very interesting beat-wise, not very interesting when it comes to rhythm in general, or certainly not interesting with the approach to the instrument, just strumming on and on. And yet there's something haunting about it, right? So you have these two stories that Handy tells, one about a railroad station, one about playing a gig. Both of them have this haunting quality to them. And so this is 1903 and 1905, and of course he doesn't publish his first blues until 1912, but clearly something stuck with him. He's looking for a way to incorporate some of these elements. And so in 1912 he publishes Memphis Blues. It was supposedly written in a different form in 1909 as a campaign song for the crooked political boss Crump, the mayor of Memphis. It included, but is not exclusively, a 12-bar blues. So, and this is very typical of Handy. Remember, he just objected to the over and over strains, right? He's not interested in a song that's just going to cycle through the same thing over and over again. So a lot of his blues, like Memphis Blues and St. Louis Blues, it has the blues, the 12-bar blues, as one component of several different strains. So again, you can see how very early on in the blues, and once again, I am... like most historians, convinced that the early blues is much more typical of the country blues, or much more akin to the country blues. But as soon as it becomes a published art form in 1912, it's tied very closely to ragtime. That's what W.C. Handy's doing here. He's combining the 12-bar blues in with other types of more typical ragtime and march-like music and dance music, foxtrots and so on. So you have this multi-strain, multi-form type of music, where the 12-bar blues is one component in that. Ragtime and marches, they're all about variety, right? And the blues isn't. The blues is while variety's not unimportant, there is a sort of monotony to the blues. It's a good monotony. This isn't a criticism. It's a kind of monotony that invites you in to sort of wade into the depth of the blues. This was the inspiration, this tune, for the Foxtrot by the Castles, and the Victor Military Band was the first to record the Memphis Blues. They recorded it in July of 1914. That's an interesting recording to listen to if you want to dig that out. An even better recording is the Prince Band, who does it later that same month, and they really have a huge hit with it and begin to popularize the Memphis Blues. And here you can see a couple different sheet music examples. On the one hand, you have this violinist who does this, as you can see, is featured in every performance, right? So once again, we see these famous performers that are put on sheet music to help sell it. And then on the other hand, you have a much more minstrel type advertisement on a different piece of sheet music, where you can see the honeybee minstrels, and there's one of them in blackface in a little circle, and then you have the orchestra behind the conductor. Notice also, I didn't point it out, but notice that also on the Memphis Blues it said a southern rag, right? So they're clearly associating this with ragtime music. And that's true of this one as well. This is St. Louis Blues from 1914. And you can see the very plain initial sheet music here. Actually, this isn't the initial sheet music. This is, I forget which edition, but you can see it's referring to it as the first successful blues published, the most widely known ragtime composition. So once again, this idea that what we're really talking about here is a ragtime composition, and the blues is one element in it. You can also see some sheet music with Rudy Valley on the front, and we talked a bit about Rudy Valley and the crooners not long ago. And we'll be talking about more crooners soon enough. But this is another way in which to sell sheet music. Have these famous people on the front. Rudy Valley at that time in the early 1920s, late teens, early 20s, he was one of the huge names. So this tune begins with a foxtrot, and Handy in his writings, in his autobiography, he talks a lot about this, that he was trying to fool the dancers, that the foxtrot has a certain step to it, of course, and once they hear this foxtrot introduction, they're starting to dance the foxtrot, and then the blues kicks in, and it's this dramatic shift in what's going on. Here you can see the opening there. And notice the bass. Look at the left hand of the piano, the dub, da 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 da, right? So that's the habanera rhythm, and the da 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 da, right? That's a foxtrot rhythm. So you've got this combination of these different dance rhythms that often go together. That's not the innovation, but then it goes into this blues. So there are several versions of these you should listen to. Try to listen to at least one marching band version, either Prince's Orchestra or whatever. But then also, of course, listen to the Bessie Smith version, and we'll talk about that later in this episode, or this. I guess this is an episode in this lecture. Notice the blues strain begins with the singing, right? So here's Sophie Tucker. Along with Marion Harris, Sophie Tucker was one of the prominent female singers of the era. She was known as a blues shouter, right? Or sometimes a coon shouter. And she did some blackface performances. She sang a mixture of sentimental and slightly bawdy songs. And she also included a great deal of banter in her live performances. So, a lot of somewhat bawdy references to sex without being totally overt. Now, the amount of sexual innuendo has been exaggerated because Bette Midler did a one-woman show based on Sophie Tucker. And even some biographers of Sophie Tucker seem to believe that Bette Midler really did her homework, and they quote that as though it was something that Sophie Tucker said, but it's not. But Bette Midler's very clear in her interviews that she made up the really dirty parts of it, but still she's trying to get at this sense of what Tucker was about. She recorded a song called Some of These Days, and that was her big hit. She recorded it several times over the course of her career. It shows up in several movies, and it's one of those songs that really typified the teens in U.S. entertainment music. So it's one of those things that if you get a chance, you should definitely listen to it. The song was so popular and so widespread that it's even discussed in the novel Nausea by Sartre. If you're into existentialism, you perhaps know that novel. And he listens to this song in two different parts, two different key moments within that novel. Now, let's talk about the first real blues, though, that was recorded. Some of These Days has blues-like elements. There are several other Sophie Tucker songs. There are a few Marion Davis songs that have these blues-like elements. We already saw the blues used in these ragtime compositions of W.C. Handy and Lassie's White. But the first true blues, where it is an over and over strain, in the sense that that W.C. Handy refers to it. We actually have, I suppose, two candidates for that. One is the 1917 recording of the original Dixieland Jazz Band, which we've talked about before. That is a blues strain. It's clearly indebted to ragtime and to New Orleans jazz, and it's not exactly a complete 12-bar loop. But it's clearly a contender, and then another, and a sung blues contender. The sung blues contender here, I suppose, is this one, and it's going to be a song called "Crazy Blues." Now, the composer of that song is Perry Mule Bradford. He's called Mule because he was so stubborn, right? He was a Harlem pianist and a song plugger, and you have to be stubborn to be a song plugger. You're trying to sell your songs to various department stores. You're trying to get various performers interested in what you're doing. So you have to be a little pushy. You have to be a bit of a salesman, and you have to be stubborn, and Bradford apparently was. He wrote a show called Maid of Harlem, which was a pretty big hit in Harlem, in black theaters in Harlem, and it featured a singer named Mamie Smith, and it had a hit song among those audiences called Harlem Blues. Now, he's going all the time to OK Records, and OK Records is going to be huge now. They're an independent record company. They're struggling a bit. But in 1920, they do agree to record some songs by Bradford. And they have a reasonable hit with the first two. Let's turn to that. They agree to record over the protests, by the way, of the recording director, Fred Hager, who feared that they'd be boycotted if they record black music by black performers. He was afraid they'd be boycotted, especially in the South, and he didn't want to lose that market. Remember, they're a small, struggling record company, right? They're business considerations. Now, he records at their studios at 25 West 45th Street on Valentine's Day in 1920. They don't record a blues at this session. They record a song called That Thing Called Love and You Can't Keep a Good Man Down. Right? And it's a white orchestra, the Rega Orchestra, which was a fairly successful radio orchestra and recording orchestra at that time. And they're not super successful, but they're fairly successful, right? They're not working at Columbia Records, they're working at OK Records, but still. And so those songs, they sell well, and they had no promotion behind them. The record company even thought about getting another singer, but they figured they'd give Mamie Smith a try, and they sell well, especially in the black market. Now, this is a bit of a revelation, because as stupid as this is about to sound, no one thought there was a black market in 1920 for recordings. Everyone figured that at least the people who were in the recording industry, by and large, figured that the people buying records were mostly white. That there might be some black households with a record player, but that was relatively rare, and it wasn't a market worth catering to. They didn't think they would make enough money if they sold things specifically marketed toward that contingency, toward that group. They were wrong. They were clearly wrong. There were plenty of households with phonographs, and this recording, That Thing Called Love and You Can't Keep a Good Man Down, this sold incredibly well, and OK spent no money on advertising, on promotion. And so then they thought, well, what's the trick here? Is it Mamie Smith? Is it Bradford? And so they bring Bradford back to record another song. Now remember, the big hit from his show, Maid of Harlem, has not been recorded yet, the Harlem Blues. That's what's recorded next. They changed the name to Crazy Blues, which is more closely associated with the lyrics of the song anyway. And they record it with a black band, with band members that have worked with Bradford before, and so he's going to play the piano, and then these other band members, these other musicians are going to play in the style that they were playing in his show. They recorded it 2 months after the previous recording. At first, OK Records wanted to get none other than Sophie Tucker. But Sophie Tucker said, I have a cold and I'm not interested anyway. Sophie Tucker, for the most part, isn't recording on OK Records. She's a huge star, right? OK is a struggling, small, independent record company. So they have Mamie Smith do it again. This album with Crazy Blues on it, it's not an album, it's a single, right? Remember, this time we're talking about releases that are one song per side. This one, with Crazy Blues as the A-side, sold 750,000 copies in a month, mostly to the black community. Now, 5,000 copies would have recouped the cost. So they made their money back over and over and over again. 750,000 copies. They were hoping for, 10. Is what they figured they might get if they're lucky. And they got 750,000, again, with basically no advertisement. They put a little bit of promotion behind this one, but almost none. And it was mostly in the black market. So this caused OK Records, and especially Ralph Peer, who was only a recording assistant for that session, but he starts to work his way up in the company, as we'll see. And they realized that there was a real market here, and that if they record songs that are specific to that market and advertise it to that market, advertise it in the Harlem papers. There were plenty of African-American newspapers at the time. If they advertise in those papers, if they advertise in those neighborhoods, then they're going to have a niche, not even a niche really. They're going to have a wide market available to them to increase their sales, and something that other record companies at this time are not doing. And that's what's important, really. OK is blazing a trail here. They're coming up with a way to approach music that other people hadn't tapped into yet. And Ralph Peer comes up with a term called race music. He doesn't mean it as a derogatory term. It certainly sounds like that to us now. But it was really just something to identify it as this is marketed toward a black audience. And they would release advertisement sheets called race record releases that would list all of the various black artists that they were releasing records from, and people would order those records or go to their local record store and buy them. So OK starts a whole race series in 1921, and they've really created an entirely new market. And so we have the rise of the race record industry in the 1920s. Columbia came to race records in 1923, following OK's example, and then Edison in 1925, Vocalion and Brunswick, which are merging in 1926, and then Victor in 1927, lagging behind the small labels. Black Swan Records is founded in 1921, and this is the first all-black record company, right? It was founded by Harry Pace as the musical director and involved Fletcher Henderson. And Pace was, of course, W.C. Handy's partner for a publishing house in 1908, and Handy is sort of loosely associated with Black Swan Records as well, and you can see their label there. They don't last that long, really, but this is a major moment, right? A black-owned and run small independent record company releasing almost entirely black music to black audiences. So this market that basically didn't exist prior to 1920. By the end of the 20s, by 1927, if you're a record company, you have to be addressing this market. It becomes a huge market. And of course, it's not all one way. There are crossovers. The Crazy Blues didn't just sell to black audiences, although it did mostly sell to black audiences. There were several white listeners to that record, especially among the upper middle class. In the 20s there was a vogue for blackness, and we'll talk about this in a moment with respect to Bessie Smith. And so there was a vogue, especially for the black blues singers among white audience members, especially among the upper middle class, and then the artistic set. Here's Gertrude Ma Rainey. If Mamie Smith recorded the first blues in 1920, like we just said, Crazy Blues. Incredibly important record. Listen to it carefully. Notice all the ragtime language that's being used there, along with the more straightforward blues language. Very important recording. But Mamie Smith was not a traditional blues singer. She was a theater singer. She was a musical theater type singer, and indeed that's what she was in. Maid of Harlem is a piece of musical theater. Most of the songs in there, all the songs except for Crazy Blues, are not a blues. That's the one blues in the show, right? And you can hear in her delivery of it that she's a great singer, but it's not the same as when you listen to the people we're going to talk about now, like Gertrude Ma Rainey, Bessie Smith, Alberta Hunter, Victoria Spivey. Those are real blues singers. They have a familiarity with the language. They approach rhythm in a very different way than you can hear with Mamie Smith. Gertrude Ma Rainey claims to have been the first to introduce the blues into a Vaudeville act. She says she started it in 1902. There's no way to prove that one way or the other. It's just what she wrote in her autobiography. She didn't record any blues, until 1923. She was touring with the Rabbitfoot Minstrels, and this was on the Toba circuit, and then it was on its own tour for a while. And she recorded for Paramount Records. Remember, they're related to the Wisconsin Chair Company. Her stage shows were these huge spectacles with a giant eagle that was behind her, this fake, I don't know if it was paper mache or what, but this big statue of an eagle was behind her. And then that eagle was supposed to be the same emblem that's on the 20 the gold coins, that she wore 20 of those gold coins as a necklace to show that she's so wealthy she can wear money as a necklace. And then she had the Paramount logo after she started recording behind her as a sort of advertisement as part of her stage show. She often emerged singing from a huge cardboard Victrola, so it looked like she was emerging out of a record player as she's singing, right? And she toured with these jug bands, but she recorded with a variety of groups, and we'll talk a little bit more about jug bands soon. They're a fascinating part of early blues history. They're clearly derived from these marching bands, but they're also related to the string tradition of the South, and so the jug bands. In 1924, she records 3 tracks with Louis Armstrong, C.C. Ryder, Jelly Bean Blues, and Counting the Blues. All of those are worth listening to. But her most famous recording is from 1928 with the Washboard Band, which was a jug band. It's a song called Prove It On Me, and that's her most famous and celebrated song. Her approach to listen to her approach to vocal production. She's got this more gravelly, darker voice. There's a kind of recklessness in a way to some of her delivery. She's also very openly bisexual, and she talks about that in Prove It On Me. Then there's Bessie Smith, the so-called Empress of the Blues. She was the most popular singer of the 20s and 30s. She recorded with Columbia Records, which was probably the biggest record company as far as business success goes of that period and of many periods. And she started recording with them in 1923, and she was promoted by John Hammond. We've talked about John Hammond before, and we'll talk about him over and over again. But John Hammond is he was involved with Benny Goodman and Fletcher Henderson. He's going to be later on down the line involved with Bob Dylan and Billie Holiday, and he's also the manager and promoter for Bessie Smith. Basically, he's an A&R man for Columbia, so he's finding these talented artists and trying to get them to sign, and then furthering their career. She had a larger white audience than most of the other blues queens. She had a great deal of vocal flexibility and rhythmic vivacity. She also played with a huge array of great artists, including Armstrong, and that's the version of St. Louis Blues that you should listen to. Louis Armstrong and Bessie Smith play an amazing version of that. And she also made a film in 1929 based on that song, sort of not exactly acting out well, in a way, it's sort of acting out. There's a whole story put to it by the director and the writer of the script named Dudley Murphy. He did a lot of these movies, these early 1920s movies with black artists. There are movies that he's done with Ellington and with Armstrong and so on. And this is one of his most famous, and it's worth seeing. It's on YouTube. I believe I put the link in the syllabus, so please watch that in its entirety. And you'll see that it's a kind of an extended music video for its time. You'll also notice, if you listen to her version with Louis Armstrong, which was her released version on Columbia, and then you watch the movie, you'll see they're different versions. The movie totally recreates her approach to the song. But the version that you should pay the most attention to, I suppose, is the one with Louis Armstrong. And notice how clever she is with the use of the verse. And she really turns it into a true blues tune. It doesn't sound at all like a ragtime tune when she does it, even though she includes the foxtrot material. She brings it back in an interesting place in the song. She also worked with Bubber Miley. We'll talk about who that is soon. Coleman Hawkins, Sidney Bechet, Benny Goodman, Jack Teagarden. She was very celebrated by Carl Van Vechten, who was a upper middle class artist, a photographer is what he's most famous for. He's also a writer, novelist, but for us, he's probably most famous for his photographs, and he took some of the famous photographs. This one is not by him, but he took some of the very famous photographs of Bessie Smith, and she was really celebrated within white artist circles and upper middle class circles, much more so than the other blues singers. Here are some of those other singers. Lucille Bogan is a fun one to listen to, especially her song Shave 'Em Dry, which is a very ballady song. That was released as a party record that was not meant for wide distribution. It has the F word and a whole lot of references to genitalia and sex throughout the whole song. And this is the beginning of that tradition. So in the late 1920s and 30s, and really actually it goes back to the teens, although those were mostly comedy records, spoken comedy records, usually in dialect. So if you go back to the teens, you can hear these Jewish comedy records and Italian comedy records and black comedy records, basically minstrel type shows. But by the time you get to the 20s and 30s, there are also these party records that are full of songs, and they're usually dirty songs. And so Shave 'Em Dry is a good example of that. Alberta Hunter, a very sophisticated sounding blues singer, definitely worth listening to, has a very long career, very storied and celebrated career. My favorite of the three is perhaps Victoria Spivey. Her approach, first of all, she worked with Lonnie Johnson, and we'll talk about who that is next time. One of my favorite guitarists of that period, just an amazing musician. And the two of them played together really, really well, interacted with each other in a way that you can hear very closely listening to each other. And this isn't just rehearsed stuff that they've done a bunch of times. I mean, it's clearly rehearsed, but you can hear they're changing things in the moment. They're really involved with each other. The other thing I enjoy about Victoria Spivey has to do with the ads that were released for her songs. Let's take a look at a few of those in summation here. Here's the ad for Furniture Man Blues. This is obviously on OK Records, and you can see sung by Victoria Spivey and Lonnie Johnson, piano by Clarence Williams. Clarence Williams, of course, who worked with Louis Armstrong and Sidney Bechet, very important figure who's often forgotten about now. And you can see they have these ads that they would put in newspapers. And here's the furniture man moving the person's furniture in, and obviously derived in some ways from minstrelsy, but also has a little bit more of a modern sensibility to it. It's clearly not a plantation painting or anything like that, but again, working with these kinds of meant to be humorous stereotypes. But then we have a more interesting ad, which is this one. This is an ad for the release Bloodthirsty Blues on one side and Dopehead Blues on the other. And you can see here that it's Victoria Spivey, and this one just says guitar accompaniment, so it doesn't list who plays the guitar on it. But notice that they take a full page ad here, and it looks like a bit of yellow journalism. It looks like a real life story. And so obviously the one song is about her kill. Actually, they both involve her killing her man. One time she does it because she's a dope fiend, right? So Dopehead Blues, and the other is just Bloodthirsty Blues. There are certain aspects. One More Sniffle comes from Dopehead Blues. It's a line in there. I've killed my man is a line in the Bloodthirsty Blues song, and I think Dopehead Blues. At any rate, so some of the lines from this come from the song itself. And you can see the illustration of the woman. It's meant to look like it's an actual story, and yet you could tell it's an ad, in part because it says, the story with all its horrors is sung by Victoria Spivey, and then tells you what record to ask for and so on, including the filing number. But notice that the story is sung with all its horror. So they're playing into this. This is, of course, the period of yellow journalism, of people being very interested in these stories like they are today. I mean, think of all the celebrity murders, the Menendez brothers, or what's her name? Jodi Arias, right? Or Scott Peterson, or whatever. All these celebrity stories that we're interested in all their little details and all the gory elements. And here you have an advertisement that plays into that. Let's zoom in a little bit so you can see some of the copy. You can see here, right? I told him blood was in my eye. He still wouldn't listen to me, and so on. And then further on, never seen so much blood. And you can see it's all set up as though it's an actual story. And then you have elements that are much more common to advertisements. So right under One More Sniffle, you see, here she is with Dopehead Blues. There's nothing that little brown lady don't think she owns. So notice that you have this mixture of what is clearly ad copy. Here she is, meaning here Victoria Spivey is with this new song, but then it immediately goes into character in a sense. So there's this blurring of the fictional character of the person, the narrative voice that she's singing from, and then Victoria Spivey is an artist. That's it for this session. Next time we'll talk about country blues, and we'll continue down this particular historical path.